Hello, I'm Abram Vanningen, an English professor at Washington University in St. Louis.
And I'm Joanne Diaz, an English professor at Illinois Wesleyan University.
And this is Poetry for All.
Today, Spencer Reece is joining us to talk about James Merrill's beautiful poem, Christmas Tree. Spencer Reece is the author of The Clerk's Tale and The Road to Emmaus. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEA, a Witter-Binner Fellowship from the Library of Congress, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholarship, and a Whiting Writers Award. While a Fulbright Fellow in Honduras, he taught poetry to the girls at the Our Little Roses Orphanage, and you can find their work in the anthology he compiled called Counting Time Like People Count Stars. His forthcoming memoir is titled The Secret Gospel of Mark. He is an Episcopal priest who works in Queens, New York. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you.
It's a real treat for us to have you on this podcast with us. And Spencer, when we invited you to be a guest on this podcast, you suggested that we read a poem together by James Merrill called The Christmas Tree. Can you just tell us a little bit about why you chose this poem?
Well, meeting James Merrill was a very important moment in my tiny little biography. I had been, before The Clerk's Tale was published, I was 41 years old, and I did not go through an MFA program or world, so I didn't know a lot of people in poetry. And 10 years before Louise Glick picked The Clerk's Tale for the Bakeless Prize, I met James Merrill through letters. I wrote him a fan letter, and he responded right away. And it was like hearing from Elvis Presley or something. It was like I had heard from the gods, and a correspondence ensued. That was the time of letters when people wrote letters. And then he came to Minneapolis, where I lived, little humble Minneapolis where I lived. And I think it's accurate that, I was like nervous, my knees were knocking when I met him, and I wanted him to like Minneapolis, and he gave a reading. And then I met him once more. And then in 1995, he died. So it was a short period of time that I knew him. I think it was about 5 years all told. And his death was a shock to me. This was the height of another pandemic, which was called AIDS. And the most poignant part of my interaction with James Merrill to me today, as now a person that's almost 60 years old, is that he knew he was sick. He knew he was dying. And he went ahead and helped me anyway. And I had no conception that he knew that he was dying, because he had kept it a great secret. There was a lot of shame still around being gay. I know that's hard for anybody listening to this that's like under 30 to believe, but there was a lot of shame. And he published a memoir at that time. He was very nervous about it. He was very nervous about his poems being collected into gay anthologies. And so this poem is so touching to me because he wrote it right at the end of his life. It's not obfuscating or impenetrable. Some of his work is, deeply elegant and rich, but not that easy. And he didn't always want his poetry to be easy. He told me he loved Wallace Stevens, and he loved that Wallace Stevens thought poetry should be, just a little bit difficult to understand. But this poem is not difficult to understand. He's writing it at the very end of his life. It's like Jesus in the last week of his life, and what Jesus says in the last week of his life is also very poignant because he knows what's coming. So he picks this very simple form, which is a shape poem or a concrete poem that's in the shape of a Christmas tree. The poem is in the voice of the tree. So if I told you that there is a poet out there who wrote a poem that was in the shape of a Christmas tree, and it was in the voice of a tree, the odds of the poem being really bad would be pretty high. It just, even today, and Christmas is coming, and God only knows with the pandemic that we've got going on right now what kind of Christmas we've got in store for us. All I know is that we've got to be just so kind as we possibly can be to each other. And this man was so kind to me, and he didn't need to be.
with all that said, would you mind reading the poem for us?
Okay, so Christmas Tree by James Merrill. To be brought down at last from the cold sighing mountain, where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still, meant I knew, of course I knew, that it would be only a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could assent to that, for honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colors flashing forth from vents in the deep, fragrant sable that cloaked me head to foot. Over me, then, they wove a spell of shining, purple and silver chains, eaves-dripping tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T, 2 staring eyes. The angels, trumpets, Bud and Bea, the children's names in clown-like capitals. Somewhere a music box, whose tiny song, played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. And in shadows behind me, a primitive IV to keep the show going. Yes, yes, what lay ahead was clear. The stripping, the cold street, my chemicals plowed back into earth for lives to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear, now or ever, dwelling upon. To have grown so thin, needles and bone, the little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice holding up wonderfully. No dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight. Faces lovelit, gifts underfoot. Still, to be so poised, so receptive, still to recall, to praise.
I'm so interested in something that you said, Spencer, before you read the poem, which is that, initially, if you hear that someone has written a poem in the shape of a Christmas tree and is speaking as the tree, it might sound laughable. You might not take it seriously, and yet it's incredible. It's a beautiful poem, and he's engaging in a long and varied tradition of visual poetry that poets have tried all over the planet for centuries, right? I'm thinking of George Herbert, who, I know you love him as a poet, and Su Hui, who is a Chinese poet, who wrote a great poem that is written as a puzzle that can be written and read in 7,000 different ways. It's incredible. So there are so many poets that have innovated with these forms. I wonder if you could talk about how you see the form working as you read these lines.
He did so many forms. Sestina's, he did every possible form he could find under the sun, and all the different meters that he could think of. And he loved Auden, and loved Auden. Auden was a master metrician. We don't talk about these fellows so much these days, but I hope we will, maybe more again soon, someday. So it's poignant to me that he's picking this because it's so simple. He's not picking terza rima or a sestina, or he's going for like the simplest thing under the sun. And I think when you're in those moments of duress, impending death, you start to think in simpler ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something beautiful that comes together for him here. I know, so there's pressure in looking at this this form poem that's in the shape of something. Because when you look at a painting in a museum, you immediately say, I like this. Or you go to the Prado and you say, oh my God, amazing. But when you look at a poem, you can't really do that. You have to, like Joanne, you were saying, you had to read this poem for 2 or 3 weeks, go over it, metabolize it, then come back to it. It's a different
Mm-hmm.
mechanism in the brain. And so in a shape poem, it's bringing those thoughts together, I guess.
I mean, the other thing I notice about just the fact of this shape. So you start with a star at the top, of course, and the first two lines are to be brought down at last. And of course, as we move through the poem, we're moving down through the tree, through the trunk at the end of the tree, and into the ground at the end, which is, of course, what is happening, what the poem is about, in effect, to be brought down and to be sent into the ground. And so the shape of the poem is also reenacting the content of the poem in that sense as well.
Totally. And yeah, then somewhere along the way you realize it's a Christmas tree, so it's cut off.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I've noticed looking at this poem is that it begins with the verb to be, and if you go back and reread the stump of the poem, it's missing the to be verb.
Mm.
So the very verb of existence, to be or not to be, which the poem opens with, by the time we get to the trunk, he's using sentence fragments and he's removed the to be verb should be in the stump, but it's not. It's gone. It's disappearing as we're reading it.
One of the places where I notice the rhymes are not quite perfect, and I think it's to the sort of incredible subtleties and relationship between form and content here, is at the very end in that stump. So if you take a look at the very beginning of the stump, the line right before it ends on the word today's, which of course rhymes with the last word praise. And then the next line down,
Oh
dusk
yeah.
room aglow, rhymes with the second to last line, still to be so poised, so, aglow and so rhyme. But then in between those two things, you have four sort of half rhymes or almost off rhymes, time and light, and then lit and foot. And so what you see happening there, or what I see happening in the trunk there, are these rhymes that are setting up as kind of bookends of the trunk that regain the balance, or that, to use his word there, the poise at the very end is regained. So the off rhymes sort of throw you off balance, and then the rhymes return to regain that poise at the very end.
That's brilliant. I had not noticed that, but you're right. You're totally right.
I think something as I hear you talking and as we look at the poem, I think I'm so moved by this poem because I can't remember anything I've read in a long time that is so good at articulating the kind of acceptance of death in the face of death that this poem presents, right? So if you look at that right before that stump as you're describing it, no dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. And the end has already begun at the very beginning of the poem, which is to say, there are some phrases in this poem that feel very relaxed to me and very accepting, and I just don't know how he crafted these sentences, but the ones that, that are sort of at the beginning of the poem, I knew, of course I knew, that it would be only a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could assent to that. There's a way in which these lines, I mean, the voice is so present. I feel so close to the voice. I don't know this person, this voice that's speaking, but it feels so at ease with what is being bestowed upon him.
Just to tie it to the end, it feels so poised and so receptive, which is where the poem brings you to a close. Still to be so poised, so receptive.
Well, and if you had met him in real life, he was very poised and he was very receptive. He was so unusual in the strange and tiny world of poetry because he was the heir to the Merrill Lynch His father was Merrill of Merrill Lynch.
The end.
So it's like his parents invented the doorknob. I think he famously said, he didn't need to go to work, and so Merrill was inspiring in that he just devoted everything to poetry. It was his life.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to reflect? Just Joanne and I were talking before about how the poem ends, and I keep coming back to that ending because I find the ending so startling in so many ways. And I'm sort of curious if you could tell me what is your reaction to this ending, because for me, when I read it, it's a giant surprise. And you have that word milagros in the middle, which means literally miracles or surprises. And they're these charms that get hung on the tree. And when we come to the end, it's been a poem of yes, receptivity, yes, assent, yes, poise, and so on, but also melancholy and lament. And the last word of the poem is praise. So I'm sort of curious how you read that turn to praise at the very end of this poem.
Well, I love that that's the last word, and it's what I feel like I'm called to do organically and unconsciously in everything I do in art. His life was not without challenges and tragedies and betrayals and disappointments. Nobody gets out of here without having some difficulties, I don't think. But I mean, that's what makes me weep is that word.
And even though this is not a religious poem in any sort of theological or dogmatic way that James Merrill has written, for it to end on praise in this way, it does seem to be speaking back to poems of praise over the long history of literature that he knew so well, no?
Well, yes. And I mean, the Christmas tree is a Christian symbol. And he was a lapsed Episcopalian, and it was all in there. And the end of the poem is to recall and to praise. And if you've ever been in the liturgy of the Catholic or the Episcopal Church, I mean that's what you say in the liturgy every Sunday. I mean, I don't think he would be that explicit, and he wasn't religious, but I am religious, and I am a Christian, and I am a priest, and I love this poem that's not exactly religious, but is seeking for those things at the end of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, with that said, and with this sort of sense of the shape of the poem and the movements of the poem, internal rhymes, things to listen for and look for, can we hear this poem again?
Christmas Tree by James Merrill. To be brought down at last from the cold sighing mountain, where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still, meant, I knew, of course I knew, that it would be only a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could assent to that, for honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colors flashing forth from vents in the deep, fragrant sable that cloaked me head to foot. Over me, then, they wove a spell of shining, purple and silver chains, eaves-dripping tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T, 2 staring eyes, the angels, trumpets, Bud and Bea, the children's names in clown-like capitals. Somewhere a music box whose tiny song played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. And in shadow behind me, a primitive IV to keep the show going. Yes, Yes, what lay ahead was clear. The stripping, the cold street, my chemicals plowed back into earth for lives to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear now or ever dwelling upon. To have grown so thin, needles and bone, the little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice holding up wonderfully, no dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight, faces lovelit, gifts underfoot. Still, to be so poised, so receptive, still to recall, to praise.
So good.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Yeah.
Thank you to Spencer Reece for joining us this week. For more information on James Merrill's work, as well as a link to see this poem, please see the Poetry for All website at poetryforall.fireside.fm.
And please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Spencer.
Oh, thank you for doing the great work you're doing. I love this.